She watched Mr. Davis and Lily with a sense of grim satisfaction, believing that soon the truth would be revealed, and she would be seen as the hero who had saved a child from harm. But as she waited, a part of her, buried deep beneath layers of prejudice and misguided concern, wondered if she had acted too quickly, if she had judged too harshly. But Mrs. Reed brushed the thought away, her gaze fixed firmly on the father and daughter she had decided were a danger to each other. The serene atmosphere at Greenfield Park was suddenly shattered by the piercing sound of sirens. The joyous chatter of children and parents faded as everyone turned their attention to the 2 police cars that pulled up with flashing lights. Mr. Davis, standing near the jungle gym where Lily was playing, felt his heart sink. His smile vanished as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, their expressions stern and businesslike. Lily, who was climbing down from the monkey bars, stopped in her tracks, her wide blue eyes filled with confusion. The officers approached them with purposeful strides. "Sir, can we speak with you for a moment?" one of them said, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Davis glanced at Lily, who had quickly run to his side, and gave her a reassuring smile, though his heart was pounding. "Of course, officers. Is there a problem?" Mr. Davis asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He knew the drill. Stay calm, be respectful, don't give them any reason to escalate the situation. But a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. The other officer, a woman with a serious expression, looked down at Lily. "Is this your daughter, sir?" she asked, her gaze shifting between the 2 of them. Mr. Davis nodded, his arm around Lily's shoulders as she clung to his leg. "Yes, this is my daughter, Lily," he said softly, feeling her small hands grip his pant leg tightly. He could sense her fear and confusion growing. The male officer stepped forward, holding out a hand. "Can I see some identification, please?" he asked. His tone was not unkind, but there was an edge of suspicion that made Mr. Davis's skin prickle. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet and handing over his driver's license. "Is there something wrong?" Mr. Davis repeated, glancing at Lily, who was now hiding behind him, peeking out nervously. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. "We received a call about a suspicious man with a young girl," the female officer said, looking pointedly at Mr. Davis. The caller was concerned about the child's safety. Mr. Davis felt a cold chill run down his spine. He could barely believe what he was hearing. "Suspicious," he echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. "I'm just playing with my daughter. We come here all the time." The male officer held up a hand, as if to calm him. "Sir, we just need to verify that everything is okay. We're not accusing you of anything, but we need to make sure the child is safe." Lily, who had been listening silently, suddenly burst into tears. "Why are you being mean to my daddy?" she cried, her small voice breaking with emotion. She clutched Mr. Davis's leg even tighter, her face buried against his side. Mr. Davis's heart ached as he looked down at her, his eyes filling with tears he struggled to hold back. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured, bending down to her level. "They're just doing their job. Everything's going to be fine." But as he looked up at the officers, he could see the doubt in their eyes, the questions that hadn't yet been asked. He felt anger bubbling up inside him, but he pushed it down, knowing that losing his temper would only make things worse. Before he could say anything else, a voice cut through the tension. "I saw him." It was Mrs. Reed striding over, her face flushed with a strange mix of anger and satisfaction. She pointed an accusing finger at Mr. Davis, her eyes blazing. He was acting strange with that little girl. She didn't look happy at all. Mr. Davis stared at her, stunned. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking with frustration. "She's my daughter. We were just playing. She's been laughing and smiling all day." But Mrs. Reed shook her head, her expression stubborn. "I know what I saw," she insisted, her voice trembling with what she thought was righteous indignation. "He was too rough with her. She looked scared." Lily, her cheeks streaked with tears, turned her tearful eyes to Mrs. Reed. "No, I wasn't scared. Daddy's not mean. Why are you saying that?" She sobbed, her little body shaking with emotion. The officers seemed to hesitate, clearly uncertain about what to do. The male officer glanced at Mr. Davis's license, then back at him. "Can you prove she's your daughter, sir? Do you have any paperwork or photos?" Mr. Davis felt a surge of helplessness. He hadn't brought any adoption papers with him to the park. Why would he? It had never occurred to him that he would need to prove he was Lily's father just to spend a day with her in the park. "I don't have the papers with me," he said, his voice tight. "But I have plenty of pictures of us at home. I can call my wife. She can bring them." Mrs. Reed scoffed. "Sure, call your accomplice," she muttered, folding her arms. "I know what I saw. This isn't right." Mr. Davis's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through the photo gallery. He'd found pictures of him, Lily, and his wife, smiling at various family events, birthdays, vacations, and everyday moments. He showed the photos to the officers, his voice trembling. "Look, this is us. We're a family." The female officer looked at the photos, her face softening slightly. But Mrs. Reed wasn't done. "Pictures don't prove anything," she snapped. "He could have gotten those anywhere. I'm telling you, something's wrong here." Lily began to cry again, louder this time, her small body racked with sobs. "Please don't take my daddy away," she begged, her voice breaking. "He didn't do anything wrong." The officers exchanged glances, their resolve wavering. Mr. Davis felt a surge of desperation. "Please," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "She's my daughter. I love her more than anything. This is all a misunderstanding." The officers seemed to soften, the tension in their shoulders easing slightly. But Mrs. Reed, her face twisted with anger and fear, shook her head. "I'm not leaving until I know she's safe," she insisted. "You have to do something." The tense standoff at Greenfield Park was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps. A young woman, her face flushed and eyes blazing with anger, rushed toward the group gathered near the jungle gym. She moved with such urgency that it was clear she had been running. As she drew closer, she called out, her voice shaking with emotion, "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to look at her. The police officers, Mr. Davis, and even Mrs. Reed seemed momentarily stunned by the unexpected interruption. The young woman, Sarah, pushed her way through the small crowd that had gathered, her gaze fixed on Mr. Davis and Lily. "That's my brother and my niece," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and frustration. She stopped in front of the officers, hands on her hips, her breathing labored from running. "What are you doing to them?" The officers looked taken aback. The male officer, who had been holding Mr. Davis's license, glanced down at it, then back up at Sarah. "Ma'am, we received a call about a possible situation here. We're just trying to make sure everything is okay," he said cautiously, his voice lacking the firmness it had held before. "Situation?" Sarah repeated, her tone incredulous. She turned to Mrs. Reed, who was standing nearby, her expression still one of self-righteous indignation. "What situation? That's my brother and my niece. They're not doing anything wrong." Mrs. Reed's face turned pale. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Her eyes darted between Sarah, Mr. Davis, and the officers, confusion and doubt flickering across her features. Sarah took a deep breath, struggling to maintain her composure. "Lily's mom, my sister, died last year," she said, her voice breaking slightly. She looked at Mr. Davis and Lily, her eyes softening with pain and love. "My brother and I adopted her together. He's her father now. They're family." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Mr. Davis felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at his sister, gratitude and relief flooding through him. He glanced down at Lily, who was still clutching his leg, her little face streaked with tears. "Sarah," Mr. Davis began, his voice barely more than a whisper. But he couldn't finish. His throat felt tight, and tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. He reached out and pulled Lily into his arms, holding her close. "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." Lily's small arms wrapped around his neck, and she buried her face in his shoulder. "I was so scared, Daddy," she whispered, her voice muffled and shaky. "I thought they were going to take you away." Mr. Davis hugged her tighter, his own tears finally spilling over. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this, baby," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry." The officers stood awkwardly to the side, their stern expressions replaced by ones of discomfort and regret. The female officer, who had been so firm and serious earlier, now looked at Sarah with a mixture of apology and helplessness. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "We had to respond to the call." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger as she turned to Mrs. Reed. "And you," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. "How dare you? How dare you accuse my brother of something so terrible? You don't know him. You don't know anything about us." Mrs. Reed's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her face had gone from pale to a deep red, and she looked as if she wished she could disappear. "I didn't know," she stammered finally, her voice barely audible. I thought she was in danger." "Danger?" Sarah repeated, her voice incredulous. "You think you can just look at someone and decide they're dangerous? Just because my brother is black and my niece is white?" Mrs. Reed's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step back, shaking her head. "I didn't mean it like that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was just worried. I thought I was helping." Sarah's anger seemed to deflate a little at the sight of the older woman's distress, but her voice remained firm. "You weren't helping. You were judging. You saw something you didn't understand. And instead of asking questions or trying to understand, you jumped to the worst possible conclusion. And look what it did to my family." Mrs. Reed's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the ground, her face a mask of shame and regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the breeze. "I really am." Mr. Davis, still holding Lily, looked at the older woman, his expression weary and sad. "We all make mistakes," he said softly, his voice gentle despite the pain in his eyes. "But please, next time think before you act. It's hard enough just being ourselves without people assuming the worst about us." Mrs. Reed nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said again, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt anyone." The officers, clearly uncomfortable, took a step back. "We're sorry too," the male officer said, his voice sincere. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble. We just wanted to make sure the child was safe." Sarah nodded, though the tension in her shoulders hadn't fully eased. "I understand," she said, her voice tight. "But please, be more careful next time. My family's been through enough." The officers nodded and slowly began to retreat, their faces reflecting the gravity of what had happened. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, people murmuring to each other in hushed tones. Mrs. Reed stood alone, her face still streaked with tears, as Mr. Davis, Lily, and Sarah turned and walked away. As they left the park, Lily looked up at her dad, her eyes still red from crying. "Daddy, can we go home now?" she asked quietly. Mr. Davis kissed the top of her head, his heart aching for the pain she had endured. "Yes, baby," he said softly. "Let's go home." The tension lingered in the air as Mr. Davis, Lily, and Sarah made their way towards the park exit. The weight of what had just happened bore down on them heavily. Lily, still sniffling, held tightly onto her dad's hand. Sarah walked beside them, her arm wrapped around Mr. Davis's shoulders, providing silent support. The crowd had started to disperse, but the curious glances and murmurs from the onlookers were hard to ignore. Just as they were about to leave the park, Mrs. Reed's voice called out behind them. "Wait," she said, her voice quivering. Mr. Davis paused, turning slowly to face her. Mrs. Reed's eyes were filled with tears, her face still pale from the shock and guilt of what had unfolded. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have judged you." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Mr. Davis, still holding Lily close, studied her face. He could see the genuine regret etched into her features, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of her own actions. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The pain and fear he and Lily had just experienced were still raw, but he could also see that Mrs. Reed was struggling with her own feelings of guilt and shame. Sarah, standing beside him, looked at Mrs. Reed with a guarded expression. "People like you," she began, her voice steady but filled with pain. "You don't know the damage you cause. You just look at us and think the worst, without knowing anything about who we are." Mrs. Reed flinched, her hands clasped together nervously. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just worried," she repeated, her voice shaking. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now how wrong I was." Mr. Davis sighed, his anger slowly melting away as he saw the older woman's genuine remorse. He knelt down, pulling Lily gently in front of him. "Sweetheart," he said softly, looking into his daughter's teary eyes, "do you want to say something to this lady?" Lily looked up at Mrs. Reed, her small face still wet with tears, but showing a hint of courage. She took a deep breath and in a small but steady voice said, "You made me really scared. I thought you were going to take my daddy away, but he's a good daddy. He loves me a lot." Mrs. Reed's tears flowed freely now. She nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I was wrong. I see that now. Can you ever forgive me?" Lily looked up at her father, then back at Mrs. Reed. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "But don't do it again." A soft smile touched Mr. Davis's lips. He stood up and looked at Mrs. Reed, his gaze gentle but firm. "We all need to understand each other better," he said quietly. "Lily and I just want to live in peace, like everyone else. It's hard when people make assumptions about us." Mrs. Reed nodded vigorously, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. "I understand. I really do," she said, her voice sincere. "I've learned a lot today. I won't make that mistake again. And I'll tell others too." Just then, several neighbors who had been watching the scene unfolded stepped forward. One of them, a middle-aged man with a kind face, reached out and touched Mr. Davis's arm. "I'm so sorry about what happened," he said earnestly. "We've seen you and Lily here before. You're a great dad, and we're here for you." Another woman, holding the hand of her young son, nodded. "Yes, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. We all know how much you love your daughter. Please don't let this keep you away from the park." Mr. Davis felt his heart swell with gratitude. It was such a relief to hear words of support after such a distressing ordeal. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, seeing genuine concern and kindness in their eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot to us." One by one, more people approached, offering words of encouragement and comfort. Some even hugged Mr. Davis and Lily, expressing their support and solidarity. It was as if the entire community was coming together to right the wrong that had been done. Lily's tears had stopped, and she looked around in surprise, her little face brightening as she realized how many people cared about her and her dad. Mrs. Reed watched this scene unfold, still standing a few steps away, her face a mixture of regret and hope. She took a tentative step forward. "Mr. Davis," she said quietly, "I know I've caused you a lot of pain today, and I don't expect you to forgive me easily, but I promise I'll do better. I'll be better, and I hope one day you'll see that." Mr. Davis looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "We all have to learn and grow," he said softly. "Thank you for your apology." As the crowd slowly dispersed, the park seemed to regain its peaceful atmosphere. Mr. Davis, Sarah, and Lily turned once more towards the exit, the tension finally lifting from their shoulders. "Daddy," Lily said, her voice small but steady, "can we come back tomorrow?" Mr. Davis looked down at her, his heart full of love and pride for his brave little girl. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle and loving. "We'll always come back." As they walked home, hand in hand, the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and a promise that, no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together with love and strength. Mrs. Reed's tears flowed freely now. She nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. I'm so sorry, Lally. I was wrong. I see that now. Can you ever forgive me? Lally looked up at her father, then back at Mrs. Reed. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. But don't do it again. A soft smile touched Mr. Davis's lips. He stood up and looked at Mrs. Reed, his gaze gentle but firm. We all need to understand each other better, he said quietly. Lily, I just want to live in peace, like everyone else. It's hard when people make assumptions about us. Mrs. Reed nodded vigorously, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. I understand. I really do, she said, her voice sincere. I've learned a lot today. I won't make that mistake again. And I'll tell others too. Just then, several neighbors who had been watching the scene unfolded stepped forward. One of them, a middle-aged man with a kind face, reached out and touched Mr. Davis's arm. I'm so sorry about what happened, he said earnestly. We've seen you and Lily here before. You're a great dad, and we're here for you. Another woman, holding the hand of her young son, nodded. Yes, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. We all know how much you love your daughter. Please don't let this keep you away from the park. Mr. Davis felt his heart swell with gratitude. It was such a relief to hear words of support after such a distressing ordeal. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, seeing genuine concern and kindness in their eyes. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That means a lot to us. One by one, more people approached, offering words of encouragement and comfort. Some even hugged Mr. Davis and Lily, expressing their support and solidarity. It was as if the entire community was coming together to right the wrong that had been done. Lily's tears had stopped, and she looked around in surprise, her little face brightening as she realized how many people cared about her and her dad. Mrs. Reed watched this scene unfold, still standing a few steps away, her face a mixture of regret and hope. She took a tentative step forward. Mr. Davis, she said quietly, I know I've caused you a lot of pain today, and I don't expect you to forgive me easily, but I promise I'll do better. I'll be better, and I hope one day you'll see that. Mr. Davis looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. We all have to learn and grow, he said softly. Thank you for your apology. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the park seemed to regain its peaceful atmosphere. Mr. Davis, Sarah, and Lily turned once more towards the exit, the tension finally lifting from their shoulders. Daddy, Lily said, her voice small but steady, can we come back tomorrow? Mr. Davis looked down at her, his heart full of love and pride for his brave little girl. He smiled a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. Of course, sweetheart, he said, his voice gentle and loving. We'll always come back. As they walked home hand in hand, the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and a promise that, no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together with love and strength. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button now to stay updated with all our latest content. Be the first to get tips, stories, and insights delivered straight to your feed. Join our community and never miss a beat.